right, we are ready to get started. Thank you guys for coming. We're really excited to have you here. Welcome to this evening's Savor event. We're super excited to have our panelists here to talk about regenerative agriculture. First of all, what is regenerative agriculture? What are some of its potential environmental impacts? And what are some of the obstacles and opportunities that regenerative agriculture presents? My name is Ned Spang. I'm the director of the Robert Mondavi Institute and associate professor of food science and technology here. And I actually work at the interface of food and the environment, so this topic tonight is very exciting for me personally. Just for some logistics, we are live streaming and recording this event right now. So our virtual audience has the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A tool on Zoom. And for our in-person audience, when you have questions towards the end, please wait for the microphone because then the folks on the virtual system can hear you. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists. Thank you guys for coming. And I'd like to invite William Garrity, the University Librarian and Vice Provost of Digital Scholarship, to the podium. Thank you, Bill.
We got the memo about kind of matching shirts.
Yeah, it's important.
Hi, I'm Bill Garrity, University Librarian and Vice Provost. The operations that Ned and I lead, we're all about food and wine, everything food and wine. And so this lecture series is a manifestation of our commitment to that. It is a formal collaboration between the Robert Mondavi Institute and the UC Davis Library. The program is designed to engage the public on topics where UC Davis is providing new insights on its research and scholarship concerning food and beverage. Tonight, as Ned noted, we'll explore regenerative agriculture, a topic personally highly interesting to me and aligned with my project in Peace Corps in Costa Rica. It is a synthesis of new science and ancient farming methods and how this approach can support a healthy environment and healthy communities. They have really been taking root, these practices have really been taking root in modern agriculture in recent years, from vineyards to family farms, although as its principles are certainly centuries old. Our moderator and panelists tonight will discuss these efforts to raise awareness for major food brands to school lunchrooms, and we, as consumers, who wield purchasing power and are influencers in our local communities, when we understand how our food is produced, we can make choices that support the health of the environment and further those practices even more. To lead tonight's conversation, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Cristina Lazcano. She is a soil ecologist and associate professor with the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources here at UC Davis. The goal of her research is to develop ecologically based soil management strategies that reduce the environmental footprint of agricultural production, promoting soil, environmental, and human health. So, Cristina, thank you very much, and take it away.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody here in the room, everybody online. It's a true pleasure to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And it's an honor, certainly, to share this panel with these speakers, leaders, trailblazers in regenerative farming. So I would like to introduce them. Jessica Chiartas is the president and lead scientist at RegenScore. Ivo Jeramaz is the winemaker and vice president of Vineyards and Production at Grgich Hills State in Napa Valley. And Linda Burch is the CEO of the Alice Water Institute for Edible Education and Regenerative Agriculture. And so today we hope to start a conversation so we can discuss what is regenerative agriculture, what are some of the main knowns and unknowns about this way of farming. And so it's my role to frame these questions and get the conversation started today. And so I'm going to be talking about exactly this. What is regenerative agriculture, if we can define it, and how, and why do we care about it? And I'll start just by discussing the situation we are in today. World population has been increasing, pretty significantly over the last 60, 80 years. And thanks to the development of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, improvements in crop breeding, and that had led to steady increases on crop yields that you can see in this graph since the Green Revolution, right? So we are able to produce more crops in a given land surface. But interestingly, at the same time as we see these increases in yields, we do see as well decreases in the efficiency of how we produce food. And the graph on the bottom of that slide shows the nitrogen use efficiency of the crops worldwide and its evolution since the Green Revolution until today. And what we see is at the same time a steady decrease in nitrogen use efficiency. So that means that today we're growing crops, and out of the fertilizer that we're adding, only 20% of that fertilizer is actually used by the crops. So this is a very inefficient way of producing food. And you will wonder, where is the rest of that nitrogen going? It's going to the environment. And so nitrogen released to the groundwater contaminates aquifers. It produces eutrophication of water bodies. It is also released to the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas. We're also suffering a great amount of biodiversity loss. We are losing biodiversity due to deforestation and intensive cultivation, both above ground and below ground. So we're losing biodiversity in the soil as well. And that leads to degradation of our soils through erosion and degradation of the topsoil. So we are losing the most important resource that is producing our food. And so we have a ton of problems associated with this type of producing food. And on top of that, the food that we produce is losing nutritional quality. There's several studies that have been done, in intensive agricultural systems that show a gradual dilution of the main nutrients in crops, staple crops like rice and wheat. So we're producing food in a very inefficient way, and it's not even meeting our purpose, right, of feeding us. So at the same time, we are facing the climate crisis, and there's increasing uncertainty on weather events, right? Here in California, we are going from extreme and really long droughts to extreme precipitation events, floods, right? So this uncertainty, it's making it really hard, right, to grow crops at the moment. There's been different farming approaches that have tried to tackle these challenges over the history, right? Some of them are newer, some of them are older. Sustainable agriculture, for example, has an emphasis on efficiency and meeting present and current needs. Climate smart agriculture is a bit of a newer approach and has an emphasis on climate change mitigation and adaptation. And then there's organic farming, who has an emphasis on natural occurring inputs and as well reducing environmental impacts of farming. All of them are, again, different focus. They tackle these challenges on different ways, so they propose different strategies. All of them valid. And so now we're talking about regenerative agriculture. So where does it fit in all of this landscape of management, right? So for that, we had to start defining what is regenerative. And the truth is that there's no legal definition yet, although the CDFA, for example, is working on it. We know that it's based on outcomes, and it's also very strongly centered on soil health and the science of agroecology. And this graph that I'm showing you in this slide, it's from a paper published in 2020, which is a review of every scientific paper that was published up to that time. What they did is synthesizing the objectives and the activities that were included in these papers whenever they talked about regenerative farming. So in terms of objectives, that's the top of that slide that you can see there. They distinguished 4 different categories. So on blue, we have all the way on the right of the slide, there is economic prosperity, right? So that's a goal of regenerative farming. In pink, we have human health. So people, it's a very big part of regenerative farming. In green, we have environmental goals. So improving ecosystem functioning, regenerating the system. And then in orange, we have goals associated to soil health, preserving soil biodiversity, improving soil physical quality, improving soil carbon, etc. And then on the bottom of that chart, what we have is the activities that could be adopted in order to reach those goals. So what we see here is that regenerative farming is really rooted in soil health. And this is like a change from previous approaches. Regenerative farming finally recognizes the importance of soils in supporting the functioning of agricultural systems and the role of biodiversity in the provision of ecosystem services like water cycling, carbon cycling, nutrient cycling, and food production. So this is really what's new, among other things that I'm going to mention later. And so soil health and promoting soil health could actually help with the challenges that we are facing. Like, for example, adaptation. It could help us adapt to climate change, and by especially regulating the cycling of water. Soil has a very central role in water cycling in agricultural systems. So a healthy soil could help capture water from storms. And so, we can recharge the soil and the aquifers below. And it could help retain moisture when we're going through droughts, and in that way support plant evapotranspiration and cool down the fields when we are going through heat waves. So the role of soil health in adaptation, it could be substantial. But also in mitigation of climate change. How is this possible? The thing is that soils have also a central role in regulating the composition of our atmosphere in the long term. And this is possible through two main ecological processes. The first one is decomposition, which is like basically the release of nutrients that are contained in biomass. And the opposite process, which is the capture of those nutrients, again, to produce biomass, right? So those two are the major life-forming processes that occur in our planet and that regulate the composition of our atmosphere. Plant biomass, the production of plant biomass, sequesters CO2. And the CO2, the carbon, is cycled through the soil and contributes to the stocks of carbon and nitrogen. And at the same time, we have a release of greenhouse gases, CO2, N2O, and methane, and this is natural. But understanding how these processes are happening, it's really important to promote carbon sequestration and reduce the production of greenhouse gas emissions. So soil has a central role in mitigation and adaptation, and it could be the future, actually. So how do we support soil health? There's like a series of principles that you can see in this slide. Adding organic matter, minimizing disturbance of the soil, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered year-round, leaving roots in the soil, and integrating animals. So we can produce animals and plants on a more efficient way. There's many practices that can be, adopted to meet these principles, like cover cropping, the use of compost, no-till or reduced till, using sheep, using chicken. I've seen a lot of things. So what is new, really? We're talking about practices that are new. They have been around for a long time. We know they work, right? Some of them are even part of traditional agriculture, like the use of animals. So what's new, really? Well, regenerative, what aims to, it's to nourish the system, to enhance internal ecological processes in cropping systems. So we think about the status quo as being an extractive way of producing food. Sustainable approaches try to minimize impact. So, it's sort of like a neutral effect on agricultural systems and on resources. Regenerative goes a step further. It doesn't only look for minimizing impacts or negative impacts, it wants to enhance the functioning of the agricultural system, so we can rely more on internal regulation of agricultural systems and reduce inputs of agrochemicals. Another new thing is that regenerative proposes stacking of practices. Combining, for example, no-till with cover cropping and compost could get us to a better outcome, more carbon being sequestered in the soil than using the practices alone. And then another thing that we're seeing now is the scale, right? We're going from something that was used by only a few people, right? Now all of a sudden we're going big scale. We're applying this type of practices over, thousands of acres and throughout the world. We're talking about a system that is being implemented at the moment in many different parts of the world. And there's big actors in the field industry that are embracing the principles of regenerative farming, like you can see in this slide, right? Really big actors. So this is what's different now. We have a challenge to make this work. And there's a lot of open questions, right? If we want to make this work in the future, if we want to have our systems be more internally regulated, right? The stance of science of agroecology that show that these practices work, but how do they work at big scale? How much carbon do we sequester with no-till versus cover cropping versus compost? How much carbon do we sequester with all the practices together? And is this working the same in a clay soil and in a sandy soil? Where is the science at? What is the contribution of this farming practice to mitigation and adaptation in quantitative terms? Are we improving the quality, the nutritional quality of the crops, right? Obstacles and opportunities. What are the barriers for adopting these farming practices, and who bears the cost of this, right? Is there a cost? Who's going to cover for that, right? Who are the important stakeholders that need to push this forward? So with the help of my panelists and you, I hope we can address some of these questions and maybe have some clarity over it. And so with this, I want to hand it over to Jessica Chiartas, who's going to talk about RegenScore.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Cristina. And thank you all for being here. RegenScore actually started as a Google Food Lab accelerator about 4 years ago and brought together nearly 100 stakeholders from all across the value chain. So we had farmers and ranchers, technical service providers, academic researchers, extension specialists, purchasers from consumer packaged goods to food service providers and retailers, nonprofits, NGOs. We had cartographers, storytellers, people coming from all sort of aspects of food and agriculture. And we were brought together on the questions of how to define regenerative, how to monitor and verify it, and importantly, how to scale it. And what we created was a program that had these 4 core commitments. So we wanted to be farmer first, evidence-backed, place-based, and market-driven. And so as we brought all these stakeholders together, we kind of ping-ponged back and forth from the needs of the various stakeholder groups, trying to make something that was accessible to growers, practical and could be applied, that was inclusive to a broad diversity of growers, but that was rigorous and scientifically based, that integrated quantitative and qualitative metrics, something that was place-based, so that had the ability to flex to the nuance of context, the different regions and production systems and climates. And that importantly was market-driven. That is something that could be shovel-ready, picked up by purchasers, used to justify making a shift in their procurement strategies. We really tried to create something that recognized that there were many roads to regenerative and met growers where they were at and took them on a journey of continual improvement. And so regenerative really is an adaptive management process. And we really need every acre involved in this transition. And so we didn't want to create something binary that said thou shalt not or thou must do this and left people out. We wanted to create something that could kind of find the balance between inclusivity and greenwashing. And so we created something that's a quantitative assessment that can actually provide a score that helps a purchaser understand where a grower is on their road to regenerative. So think like a wine spectator score. And we landed with three distinct categories: transitional, continual improvement, and regenerative. And so in transitional, it's really just getting people on the train. There's a very low barrier to entry. You have to be doing a minimum of one sort of conservation, climate smart, sustainable practice. There's no need to be doing any existing monitoring yet, but in order to move into the next phase, you have to establish a baseline for monitoring. You have to start to adopt more practices, monitor more outcomes, and you can move further along on the journey. The important distinction between these categories is that in transitional, you actually don't get direct market access. So purchasers can't discover these farms and ranches in order to integrate them into their procurement programs. What they do get access to is what's called transitional finance. So funding to be able to adopt new practices or expand the acreage of existing practices. Again, because we recognize that there's a lot of risk in the transition and that we need everyone involved, we wanted to create a way to really support growers in that process. But once they move into continual improvement, regenerative, they would be able to be searched, filtered for by purchasers by a number of different variables: their practices, outcomes that they're achieving, verification approaches that they're using, their background, all sorts of specific identifiers that I'll kind of tell you a little bit more about as I go through the onboarding surveys. And so out of that accelerator that I mentioned, we created a series of onboarding surveys designed for specific production systems. So we have one for croplands, one for orchards, vineyards, rangeland, dairy, and pastures. The goal long-term is to get even narrower, to have like a specific survey and scoring system for almonds in the Central Valley, or actually working with General Mills, for instance, on an adaptation for wheat in the Great Plains. But we started kind of at this broader entry point, and essentially, we believe that the practices that will be used to achieve regenerative management are going to vary amongst those different production systems or even amongst different regions. We imagine that the outcomes that are achievable will vary, but the principles are fairly universal. And so all of our question sets or surveys are framed around these principles I'm going to share with you. And then I'll talk a little bit more about how that translates into practice. And so the first principle is to engage your community. The next one is reduce disturbance, keep the ground covered, tighten nutrient cycles, reduce external inputs, optimize water use efficiency, promote biodiversity, ensure worker welfare, ensure animal welfare if there's livestock in the system, and to monitor outcomes. And so this is kind of little screenshots from various of the onboarding surveys, but just to give you an idea of how the principles take us to practices. So we ask what you're doing, for instance, to reduce disturbance, and there's a variety of different practices the grower may be using. If they are, for instance, using shallower tillage, we ask what depth you till to. Or if they're using less frequent tillage, we may say how many passes per year. Everything's reported on a percent acreage basis, and that's actually integrated into the score. So the more acreage you're doing something on, the higher your score. Again, what are you doing to keep the ground covered? Perhaps they're cover cropping. We ask how they're planting, how they're terminating. Maybe it's multi-species cover cropping, and we'll ask those in addition to how many species. We ask what they're doing to tighten nutrient cycles. Again, there's a diversity of potential things that they're doing and could be some follow-up questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to not show the follow-up questions for everything, but what are you doing to reduce inputs? If they indicate they're reducing their pesticide use, we might ask for a little more information on how. Their herbicide use, what they're doing to maximize water use efficiency, promote biodiversity, and again, ensure animal welfare. The next kind of component of our scoring framework and kind of how we think about regenerative is around monitoring outcomes. And there are a lot of folks who, this is where a lot of the sort of debate around regenerative, I think, comes into play. Some people, it's carbon tunnel vision. They're just thinking about sequestering carbon and mitigating climate change. We take a slightly more holistic approach, and we have 5 ecosystem co-benefits, which also receive their own individual scores. And so we look at soil health, air quality, water, both quality and quantity, biodiversity, and equity and worker welfare, which we're actually in the process of expanding to a broader social impact outcome that includes things like community health and human health. And some of the things that we imagine folks might be monitoring, although again, we try to take an approach that you could be measuring a number of different things, and we also invite growers to share with us things that they may be measuring that we haven't thought of. But around soil health, a lot of the key things that we see around soil carbon, nutrients, pH, electrical conductivity, aggregate stability, bulk density, surface hardness. There's an infield soil health assessment that's more qualitative from the NRCS. Around air quality, folks are looking at direct greenhouse gas emissions. Some folks are actually measuring those. Some are modeling them. There's approaches to looking at soil loss through modeling as well. There's also sensors that can be used to actually measure dust emissions, so things like particulate matter, 2.5 and 10, which have impacts on our respiratory health. And then, from the input perspective, we don't just ask you what you're doing on a practice perspective to kind of improve your nutrient management or your pest management, but we also ask quantitatively, how much are you reducing your actual inputs? Water quality and quantity, there's a few metrics we look at that are directly related to soils, so things like water holding capacity or infiltration rates. But we also, again, asked about your total water use. We ask about fertilizer use or efficiency. And then for folks who are actually collecting runoff samples and can look at the water quality, there's a number of different metrics we can look at as well. From the biodiversity perspective, we are thinking about the entire food web, right? From the smallest of microbes in the soil all the way to the pollinators and birds above ground, and looking at both abundance and diversity. So how many you have overall, and then the diversity of species, as well as things like plant cover and plant diversity. And then from a social impacts perspective, there's a lot of different things and frames that we can look at this. This is one of the, I think, key things about regenerative that is often left out in some approaches to regenerative. It's one of the things that is, people feel has been left out in some of the other existing certifications or approaches to improved agriculture. And so we think about things like equity. So, are you a small or limited resource farm? Are you a member of a historically underserved community? Are you cooperatively owned? So we can kind of think about changing the model in agriculture. There's also a series of metrics that look directly at worker welfare. So things like hiring workers as employees with benefits, or paying a living wage, or overtime, or extra pay for night shifts, bonuses, profit sharing. There's a few international sort of conventions like the International Labor Organization or the Fair Food Council's Code of Conduct, which also have a lot more in-depth details on these sorts of practices. And we ask if folks are adhering towards those conventions. Things like providing adequate shade structures, community gardens or free food on farm, educational training to laborers, hosting harvest or seasonal celebrations. Again, thinking about building the community around a farm as well. The things below the line are kind of the broader social impacts. So things like engaging in a network or a hub in your area, kind of bringing back the Grange and getting farmers talking to one another again and sharing what's working and what's not. Whether or not they're actually contributing to their local food system, selling direct to consumer within a 100-mile radius. And we can look exactly at the percentages of their sell that are in each of those categories and give credit as such. We ask if they're doing things to minimize food loss, or if they're donating excess food to local food banks or pantries, if they're sponsoring local sports teams or community organizations. We really think about regenerative as being not just something that we're asking the farmers to do on their land, but a broader cultural shift, right? And this extends beyond just how the farmers engage in their community, but how purchasers engage with producers. So thinking about actually shifting the power dynamics between the purchasers and the buyers. Again, not taking this prescriptive approach, we have a number of different ways that we can verify these practices or these outcomes. Certifications is bolded because I think that's the one people consistently go to. And there's challenges with certifications. They're a tool and a good tool for verification, but they provide barriers to entry for some folks. They can be quite costly. Again, they can be quite prescriptive where they're binary, and so they don't provide that really pathway for transition. And with technology, we're seeing all sorts of other ways to verify things on the ground. And so it could be geotagged, time-stamped photos or videos. It could be creating interoperability to farm equipment data or farm management software where we can just pull that data directly into RegenScore. It could be satellite imagery or GIS data, receipts or billing statements, third-party affidavits from a technical service provider or an ISO certified verifier, and things like sensors, irrigation water and flow meters. These are all kind of different tools we can use to provide verification on the ground and really democratize verification and make getting a value added on the market more accessible to growers. So I'll kind of talk a little bit from there about this sort of what Regenerative has done in the sort of certification space. As there's been growing interest, there's also a growing tension, I think, between regenerative and organic, because justifiably so, organic has worked hard for many decades to build a value add on the market to get a premium, and regenerative threatens that, right? There's a, someone could not be doing all the things that an organic farmer is doing and still get a market premium or a forward contract or something of that nature. And I sit in the middle. I see both sides. I understand because I've seen some regenerative approaches that do succumb to greenwashing, that are very simplistic and just say, just reduce your tillage and throw a cover crop out there and it's regenerative. And oftentimes in those cases, there's a huge increase in the amount of herbicide application. We've seen ranges from 10 to 47%. There can be increases in fertilizer application. And often because they're leaving residues on the surface and these things are water soluble, they're able to get into the environment more. And so there's concerns that people are going to get a regenerative label, they're going to get a price premium or better shelving on the market, and they're not going to be really regenerating the environment. They're not going to be actually creating regenerative outcomes. The challenge there is that this is not a light switch you can just turn on. You can't just change a conventional system to regenerative overnight. You can't take a speeding bullet train and just stop it immediately, or especially not turn it around. And so we need to recognize that there needs to be a way for growers to transition and that there's risk involved in that. And so it really comes down to a theory of change, I think, is in how we approach regenerative. Because if we try to be binary and if we try to be too exclusive and we say organic's the floor, then all those conventional growers who I personally had like some incredible conversations with conventional growers who actually have hope in regenerative. They see it as a way off the treadmill. They see this as a lifeline they've been thrown. Many of them are literally losing the farm right now. And it's a way that they can actually start to implement more ecologically beneficial practices and have a market that supports them in that transition. And so it's a hard situation, and that's why I think something like RegenScore, where we can quantify it and we can be transparent about where someone is in their journey, can kind of maybe help us find the sweet spot. I'm getting told to wrap up, so just as a quick summary of RegenScore, there's a single RegenScore that determines their category. They get these 5 ecosystem co-benefit scores, and underneath that are all the practices, outcomes, and verification approaches that they may be using to get there. I'm going to skip past this in the interest of time. It just kind of talks through our platform and how we get growers onboarded. But I'll just close with kind of some regenerative pillars that we've really centered around. Context is key. It needs to be outcomes oriented. That doesn't mean throwing out the practices or the proverbial baby with the bathwater, but we do need to be mindful that outcomes are being achieved. We need to meet growers where they are and take them on a journey of continual improvement. It's less practice-based, more principle-based, understanding that the practices that work in one place may not work elsewhere, but we can all achieve the same principles. And we have to move beyond carbon. We have to look at reducing inputs and promoting biodiversity and promoting equity in our food systems. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have now Jeramaz, who's going to talk about regenerative farming from his own experience, right? You've been growing regenerative for a long time.
Yes. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. For me, this is goes far beyond growing fine grapes and making great wine. I'm passionate about regenerative farming. I have 6 kids. I want them to live long, healthy lives. I don't think it's possible with the food that we produce today. So this is a great platform to hopefully convince all of you to demand better food. Even certified organic food is, you only know that you're not eating poison, but does it have quality? Does it have nutrients that we need? So regenerative farming, in my opinion, is the only way forward how to produce healthy food. So I have 7 minutes to go back 430 million years to explain how everything works. So tighten up your seat belts and hang on with me. Yeah. So today's farming is all about inputs. And we already mentioned here that it's a very inefficient system, pollutes. When we talk about who's going to pay for this, who's going to pay for cleaning up, who's going to pay for our diseases, we are spending 3 times more per person on health care, and we are number 17th in health. What about that? So there's plenty of money there if you are healthy to pay for a bit higher price of food. So problem with, again, today's farming is the chemical farming is inefficient, it pollutes, it degrades soil. But main point here is there's no shortage of nutrients. When you talk to conventional farmers, why do you need fertilizers? They say, anytime you grow something and harvest it, you're depleting nutrients, all true. If you don't put fertilizers, we'll run out of nutrients. That's not true. So this is a test that we run once per every block. And you can see all these nutrients on the left side. Then in the middle, nutrients, these are pounds per acre in only first 8 inches. And you see thousands of pounds of nutrients, but they are not like a calcium, they are not ionic form, they are tied to something else. So there's no shortage of nutrients below our feet, we'll never run out. Nitrogen, there's 17 million pounds of nitrogen above every acre. Only thing is, obviously, it's triple bond and plants cannot grab it, but microbes can. So there is the solution for our problem. So this is example. So I'm in the grape business, and I took this from a book. If you want to grow 4 tons of fine Cabernet, Napa Valley Cabernet, this is all what you need. You're removing 12 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphorus, and only 44 pounds of potassium. And you saw chart before, there's thousands of pounds below our feet. So we have no lack of nutrients, we have lack of functionality of soil. Then how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this problem? Well, we already have recipe. It's been in place for 430 million years. And it's called liquid carbon pathway. So we've been 25 years, for 25 years we've been organic. And one main frustration in my farming and experience was that despite massive amount cover crop, massive amount of compost that we're putting on soil, our gains in soil organic matter was minimal, maybe 1% over 15 years. Soil organic matter is not most important thing in soil, but one of the most important parameters of healthy soil. So it's a very simple test and it's reliable. So most of us using it to evaluate the progress in our healthy farming. So why could not we gain more soil organic matter with organic farming? So basically we were growing cover crop, tilling it. And then when you till it, you basically favor bacteria. So there's 3-4 major, the microbes are bacteria, protozoa, and fungi. Let's name 3 main ones. So we were favoring microbes, bacteria, but they did respiration. Just like us, when we eat steak, we respire it, and there's energy, and there's CO2 coming out. So respiration releases CO2. That's why that CO2, carbon that was supposed to go in ground, was going up. You probably know that since Industrial Revolution, we had 280 parts of CO2. Today is 400 parts per million. 1/3 of that was product of our agriculture. So there is, with the conventional agriculture, you're releasing CO2. So the liquid carbon pathway is a key to establish growing. So liquid carbon pathway starts with photosynthesis. Before we can have that, we have to have a green growing crop. That's why we put cover crop. Our plants in winter are dormant, grapevines, but we put cover crop. We are lucky to live in California. Climate is moderate, lots of rainfall, cover crop grows like crazy. So our job as a farmer, we have to capture energy of sun. That's our main job. So we are capturing it through photosynthesis, putting carbon and new energy into the plants. Once carbohydrates, simple sugars are produced in leaves, they are fed. 50% of carbohydrates are used to feed microbes. So this is that natural system, been working for 430 million years ago. So, so when you do that, then you basically have unleashed microbes. This is called symbiosis. Plants feed microbes, give them energy in exchange for nutrients. If plant needs calcium, plant cannot just grab calcium from calcium carbonate. Only microbes have enzymes to dissolve it and make it available to plants. So this is that symbiosis. When we study nature, we believe everything fights in nature, but overwhelmingly, nature works together if you set it up that way. So I'll cover a few principles. We already talked about this, both of you. No-till, very important. Why? I already mentioned, when you till, you destroy structure of soil. Also, you're favoring bacteria and fungi. We have to turn soil to be bacteria-dominated to fungi-dominated, because that creates a very healthy soil, improves structure, and improves availability of nutrients. If you go on coast, you might encounter a sequoia that is 2,000 years old. If this theory of depleting nutrients works, how the heck that the tree is still there after 2,000 years? Because when you dig deep down, or even if you poke a few inches, you will see there's the roots of sequoia. Then there's probably 1,000 times more of fungi. What is interesting with fungi is it's not just on one tree. It's an original wide world web. It was created underground. So what is fascinating about this is that all plants that you grow in your vineyard or anywhere are connected. And there's these highways, which is fascinating. I know next to nothing about it, but I see results. And good news about this is we do not need to know every intricacies of how this works. Just as cars are very complicated today, do we know how every part works? Absolutely not. Can we drive cars? Absolutely, all of us, most of us. Yeah. So no-till, again, sponsor creates a better structure. Actually, you destroy soil structure with tilling. Structuring soil can only be accomplished by living plants. Cover cropping, already mentioned, it cannot be just 3 kind of grasses. You have to have at least four functional families of plants, like grasses, broadleaf plants, flowering plants, stuff like that. Why? Because each family of plants come with their own biodiversity around roots. You need as many as possible to work to create quorums. We all in business, we know that without quorum, nothing goes. Same thing works with microbes. They need quorum. Once population grows, then they can switch genes, and all of a sudden these learner PhDs can explain that. I mean, I'll leave these intricacies to them to explain how this works. So also, I thought until a few years ago that the microbes are only soil and they'll just come to our roots. But more I learned, it's just fascinating that one barley seed that we plant, like one cover crop that we put is barley. One seed has 9 billion microbes on it. So plants come prepared with everything that you need, they bring with them. So you just have to put them in a soil and do not put fungicides, do not put Roundup, and everything will take care of itself. Structuring soil can only be, I already covered this, only be achieved in the presence of growing roots. Most important part of the slide is, last year we took 32 soil samples, and on average we gained 0.9%, only 1% of soil organic matter, almost 1%, which in the organic system took 15 years. So this is, again, it's impossible. You read all scientific research, and that's, you probably say that's not possible. It's not possible to bring soil organic matter up this dramatically. When you have this 1% gain of soil organic matter over 1 acre, 1 foot deep, you can hold about 50, there's controversy, 25, you know, this lady says 25,000. Okay, let's give it 25,000. But that's actually all water we need to drip. So 25,000 gallons extra water. We know there's a shortage of water. And so basically you are turning your soil into a sponge. So it is not how many inches a year we got. It is how many inches of water your soil can hold. So this well-structured soil holds your water. Without water, there's no life. There's no growing any plants. So then last part of my slide is many people believe that we have disease because there's a pathogen. But if you investigate healthy field and sick field, plants, I mean, you might find that pathogen is identical in both soils. It's just environment. Is there more microbes in this healthy crop? So basically, the regenerative farming provides us with the soil that supports health, and you don't have to worry about spraying and how to kill these pests and diseases. So biodiversity of plants and animals is a key component of a healthy farm. So this is key. Healthy farm equals healthy soil equals healthy people. Very important thing to remember. So I already mentioned about these soil samples that we done at Grgich and gained 0.9% of soil organic matter in 1 year. Cost. When I talk to our friends, farmers, why don't you convert? First thing is I cannot afford, it's too expensive. So these are costs. Per our accountant, he counts for over 150 wineries, so its numbers are accurate. Napa Valley average farming cost 15,000, Grgich is 11. This year I'll be going toward 10. Then the second big cost is depreciation, and it's about $3,800 for Napa Valley. Ours is $1,300. So dramatic cost savings. So regenerative farming is more profitable than conventional farming. So now to finish, so some pictures of what we do. So we have, this is no-till seeder. You might say, why are you seeding? You already have cover crop there. So now in spring we seed sunflowers. So you can see on this picture there's too many grasses, broad leaves, not enough flowers. So we are trying to, every 10th row is, we call it insectary rows. We plant flowers. This would be probably April. You can see already there's a bud break there. So this is typical. You see, this is kind of ideal. We have probably 15, 20 different species of cover crops, including lots of flowering plants. Sheep, absolutely unavoidable. But context, you said context. You have to know what you're doing. You cannot bring sheep and put them for 1 month, one area, they overgraze and compact soil. So it has to be intensive grazing. In our case, 500 sheep, over 3 acres, we have little enclosures, 24 hours. We only let them eat 50% of our grass, and then you move them. So each one we measured, it leaves us nice 2 pounds of droppings every day. And that's, sheep as cows, they have 4 stomachs. So their droppings are full of microbes, and that's kind of how you regenerate your soil. Nothing new. This is how American prairie was created. Most fertile soil in the world, with bison, wolf chasing them. So we are copying what worked for millions of years. I hope I'm not talking too fast with my Croatian accent and speed. Hopefully you understand 50%. That's good enough. I'm happy. So this is another, after sheep is gone and a bit later, the grass is still growing. We do not cover it, actually, we don't cut it, we roll it. And it leaves beautiful mat of straw to be when you get the heat. Soil has to be covered at all time. We have severe hot weather here, you cannot bake soil. These are examples of insectary rows, which are very important. We have mealybugs, and I strongly believe you will never get rid of mealybugs, but you can minimize damage. You can have small amounts, because the mealybug has many different predators, but they need nectar, they need a place to live. So you create a place to live, and they take care of your mealybugs. So also, this is what we have in our biodiversity of livestock or all kinds of animals. We are very passionate about bees. Now we're installing these their houses, and we don't harvest honey. We are not interested in that, but they are not disappearing. They are staying there, and we have, like every vineyard has a few of these. Some vineyards, they come right away. Some others, we have to wait a year, but all of them are occupied now. So is that me? Okay, thank you. So I'm wrapping it up, just 3 seconds. So if you have golfers, we installed our boxes. They eat up to 6,000 UC Davis. Actually, you guys are investigating this in a corporation. We have small boxes for singing birds. They eat insects up to 800 a day. That's how you deal with insects. We all do this for obvious reasons. We love regenerative farming, but this is the result. This is one of the oldest Cabernet vineyards in Napa Valley, planted in '59. It'll outlive me, probably outlive my kids. I don't see why I wouldn't live another 50 years. Incredible crop, over 3 tons per acre every year, best quality. This is possible with this kind of farming. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Those pictures were beautiful. I can see your vineyard is very healthy. So Linda, tell us a little bit about your role in the Alice Waters Institute.
Yes, the Alice Waters Institute for Edible Education and Regenerative Agriculture, right there in the title. It's all about leveraging the procurement power of school food, institutional procurement, but starting with school food, to accelerate the shift to a regenerative, organic food system. And it starts with Alice Waters, who does not need to be introduced to this crowd in any way, shape, or form. But she, I think, if you really think back to where this all comes from, it's 50 years ago with Chez Panisse. From one restaurant in Berkeley, California, Alice helped to launch a farm-to-table movement across the United States, and taught us all about seasonal food, about taste, about flavor. I think she was saying things about how health is in the soil a long time ago. And she was celebrating farmers and elevating the people that steward the land and keep us all fed and healthy. There is a farmer who is very, very important to her. His name is Bob Kennard, who, back 40 years ago, was doing organic farming. It looked very regenerative if you look at these pictures now today. And Alice and Bob really invented a circular regenerative kind of economy between one restaurant and one farm 45 years ago. In which case, Alice always says, once I leaned in and listened to the farmer and purchased everything that he grew, I began to learn about the soil. I began to learn about biodiversity. I began to learn about where taste comes from. And so he would deliver to her door in Berkeley, California. She would not menu plan until she knew what the produce was that was arriving, then created menus, cooked this simple food, and then the waste, the food waste from the kitchen would go back to the farm. Circular, regenerative, 45 years ago. And to this day, there are many other farms that are supplying chez panisse, but the principles are the same. Seasonal, local, organic, now regenerative food leads to beautifully tasting, nutrient-dense, healthy food for us all. And so those are the principles that Alice has conveyed to all of us over many, many years. You also know that 30 years ago, she founded something called the Edible Schoolyard Project, also from one school, middle school in Berkeley, California, inspired 6,500 schools across the country and around the globe that essentially take school gardens and kitchens and transform them into classrooms to teach the core academic subjects of math and science and humanities, but more importantly, I think, to convey the values of nourishment, of community, of equity, and about environmental stewardship. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would have been calling it environmental stewardship, which we still do. But now Alice is saying, climate awareness. She has always believed that schools and farms need to be connected, that children and farmers are somehow connected, that every child has the right to a great education, and every child has the right to great nourishing food. And so these campaigns over the past decade that have led to universal meals in California schools and to a thriving farm to school movement in the state, thanks to our governor and first partner, have made that real. So now, what is the Alice Waters Institute? Alice has coined a phrase. She calls it school-supported agriculture. So if you think of farm to school, this is closing the circle, school to farm, uplifting farm workers, making the soil more healthy. She calls it school-supported regenerative agriculture. And the idea is very simple. It is that schools and universities, if they were to purchase all of their food locally within 100, 150 miles from their local food net, directly, without a middleman, without the transportation that happens when food is shipped thousands of miles, without thinking about all of the extractive steps in the process that lead to really costly food, but no benefit for farmers, that you could create a really beautiful system that would ultimately help us mitigate climate change. It would advance human health. It would strengthen local communities because the relationship between the farmer and the school would be close. They would be creating reliable markets, concentrated demand for farmers that are transitioning to regenerative organic agriculture. And that is, when we think about the barriers to this shift to regenerative agriculture, some of it's about the science and not knowing yet the outcomes. Some of it is about trying to be able to measure the outcomes. Some of it is about the practices that need to be taught by any number of great nonprofits here in California that teach farmers how to transition to new practices. The other thing that's missing is reliable markets with concentrated demand. And schools are the largest restaurant chain in America. We're talking about 4.9 billion meals per day. And think of that being leveraged if kids also are being edibly educated to understand where their food comes from, how there are practices that can actually restore the soil. It's, as Alice says, it is the only delicious and hopeful climate solution that exists today. And she's passionate about this. And so the Alice Waters Institute is all about trying to make this happen in 3 ways. First, through thought leadership and advocacy, leveraging Alice's reputation as a climate activist, as a food activist, as an author and chef, and figuring out how to convene policymakers, farmers, educators, philanthropists in ways that create discussion and public pressure and public awareness about this option. As Alice says, we do not have time to wait. We are in crisis. It is immediate. We have a solution. It is beneath our feet. We just have to lean in and make it happen. So that's number one, using her bully pulpit is another way of saying it. The second is that we are working to help food service directors in K-12 schools and in universities learn how to do local, seasonal, regenerative, organic procurement, and connecting farms and value-aligned food hubs with school districts to make that, that kind of robust relationship happen. And thirdly, we're all about creating models. If you think of Chez Panisse, it was a model that launched a movement. And so was the Edible Schoolyard Project. Now Alice would like to create, on a University of California campus, a model of school-supported agriculture that is holistic systems change model that starts with procuring food from local regenerative organic farms, that leads to seasonal menu planning that can then translate into, seasonal crop planning, that one can begin to teach about procurement in ways in which there is the potential for some advanced forward buying contracts, thinking about pricing. So we are in the midst of developing curriculum and doing training workshops to model that. But imagine a UC campus that was willing to lean into this, either with a full dining hall to begin with, or maybe even just a small farmers market cafe to show the circularity of it. The food would come in, the produce would come in. Up at UC Merced, for example, there are a lot of students that work in the dining halls there. And they have been talking to us about a really neat idea of a farmers market cafe where they're doing seasonal, local, regenerative, organic food. The students are learning how to cook that way, thinking about the farmer first, and then they become edibly educated about food systems and become the ambassadors that go out to the rest of the community. So ideas like this where the waste returns, the university farm is leveraged, the aspects of equity in terms of food pantries, et cetera, that are on site get filled up with local regenerative organic food. So these are the ideas that we're working on. With numerous campuses are being explored across the UC system. We have a partnership with the UC Office of the President, University of California Office of the President, and helping them think through procurement strategies on a systems basis. And I would say Alice is known to be a advocate and a purist, and we need those in the world, but we also need to be able to understand where the UC system is in terms of its sustainability goals and try to find the way to get to the North Star together. In the meantime, while we're awaiting the moment of a model on a UC campus, and ultimately, yes, a training academy and hopefully research center and convening center at UC Davis in the future, we're doing some pilot tests in K-12 that are really interesting. So we are working with LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in the country, 500,000 kids. Now we have universal meals times 3, 1.5 million meals per day. That's a lot of concentrated demand that really and truly wants to transition to local procurement and regional procurement in a meaningful way. And so we are one of 2 nonprofits that are advising them on that. Got a long way to go, moving the Titanic, but it's beginning. And then the last thing we're doing from a pilot perspective is, ultimately it'd be great to have a physical institute, but I strongly believe program comes before building. And we are working to have training workshops, bringing 15 food service directors together with 15 organic and regenerative farmers on a regenerative farm. And then basically Alice has got a new cookbook coming out next year called School Food Revolution. It is another manifesto, but it also has these incredibly great, culturally diverse recipes that are within the nutritional requirements and the cost requirements of the reimbursement. And we're bringing these farmers and food service people together. They cook 3 of these meals together. They sit down at the table because Alice believes you don't convince people of ideas, you feed them ideas. You gather and change happens. And then we spend the afternoon working through all the supply chain problems. Who doesn't have a refrigerated truck? Who doesn't have storage? What is happening in terms of pricing and costing? And it's that nuts and bolts kind of really building relationships and trust in each other that I believe leads to the potential to create a patchwork of regional regenerative work. Obviously, there have to be the farms. There's also other things that have to happen in terms of financing the conversion and of land. But that is a beautiful thing that could really and truly lead to an acceleration in the shift. So with that, I leave you with the delicious, hopeful solution to climate change.
Thank you so much, Linda. I want to make sure we have time for questions in the room and questions as well online. And so now, please, the room is yours if you want to ask any questions to the panel.
Thanks very much.
Where'd the clicker go?
Very interesting. I'm convinced. So my question is, I know that the battle to have a legal definition of organic was a long, hard-fought battle. And I'm wondering, one, if that battle is underway for regenerative agriculture, and 2, even if it isn't, do you think is that a helpful thing? I mean, how does that fit into pushing this technology and practices forward?
I think you're next.
I think that's yours, Jessica.
Arguably, that was part of the problem with organic. When organic started, In fact, I think you mentioned about there's not been a certification focused on soils. I think a lot of the original organic growers were focused on soil health, but the legal definition has lost that. I mean, if you look at organic farms today, as organic is scaled on a large acreage, it's very soil intensive. There's often more tillage than on conventional farms because they don't have the same tools in their toolkit for getting rid of weeds or things like that. And so, yeah, I think that it's good to have transparency and clarity around what someone's getting, especially if they're paying a price premium for a consumer to see something on a label, to know that they're actually getting the outcomes that they're paying extra for. But the problem is that agriculture is not, it doesn't fit nicely into a certification. It's not it's so dynamic and it's so different from place to place. And so to like codify that into a policy definition is really hard, unless it's like very broad. And then how do you operationalize a very broad definition? So it's complicated. I think we have technology today that does allow more transparency. Even if it's like, I mentioned geotag, timestamp photos and videos. And that sounds silly in some ways, but every grower has a phone in their pocket that they can document what they're doing. And to Linda's point, like, this is a connectivity that can help purchasers, help consumers or eaters better understand where their food comes from, who and how, who's growing it, how it's grown. And then you can still have that sort of transparency. I mean, you mentioned something when you saw Ivo's pictures, like, looks regenerative to me. You walk on a regenerative farm, on a farm, I should say, and you know if it's regenerative or not. I mean, literally our senses are attuned to it. You can smell it, you can hear it in the bird song, you can see it in all the beautiful diversity of plants and colors. If you're really a nerdy soil scientist like me, you can taste it in the soil. It's, and you would say you can taste it in the crop, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to embody what is regenerative into a policy, and I worry that it could water it down. A lot of what regenerative started, the big moment I think that tipped the scales was when organic allowed hydroponics in agriculture. And you go to I won't name a name, but a very large berry grower on the Central Coast, and it doesn't look very regenerative to me, but it's organic and they'll get a premium on the market. So yeah,
We got a question in the chat. I want to make sure, and I think this is for Linda. What is the solution for schools that no longer teach students about cooking and kitchen basics?
Yeah, well, what I think is really interesting is that the cafeteria can be a learning environment. What's interesting with LAUSD, they actually have quite a few high schools that are both ag high schools and culinary arts high schools, and we've been working with a bunch of those around edible education. But I think there's also been this pretty dramatic movement of garden and kitchen on school properties. And those schools have embraced edible education and environmental education and climate education and incorporated it with essentially, typically science. And so it's much more widespread than you would think today. The bigger problem is that these schools don't have kitchens, honestly, to cook the food in the way in which kids should be able to eat it. And they're really all about heat and reserve. So the big money that has come in through CDFA into farm to school has been a lot about kitchen infrastructure. It's about training cooks and chefs. But edible education is also part of it as well. So there's even school districts are applying for funding to teach kids about food systems at this point in time.
Yeah, one question there.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, I am on. Okay. Yeah, I grew up on a family farm and a row crop farm, and so basically the decision every year is which crops to plant. And speaker number 3 was very helpful because he was saying, this is how much it costs, and there's an operating margin that's about 5 or 6%, and so then you got to try and figure out how are you going to do that. Speaker number 2 is not as helpful because she's saying it's hard to come up with a metric for regenerative. So if you're trying to convince 10,000 farmers in the U.S. to go regenerative, what you need to do is come up with the definition and how much it's going to cost. That's it.
So I may just clarify. The way our program works is not to say that we don't have any sort of definition. We just recognize it's context specific. So rather than creating a certification or something that's broad sweeping and says we're going to treat everything the same, we create scoring frameworks that are adapted to specific regions and production systems. And so we actually do a literature review. We look at the science and what we know. We engage experts on the ground in actually ranking all those practices I shared, all the potential outcomes, looking at what the potential is for outcome improvement in those contexts, and our scoring framework is adapted to those. And so a grower could see, how can I improve my score actually? And that's not something we have built yet, but a technology we hope to integrate is to actually be able to provide decision support of how you can improve your score. What are the practices that would work in your region, in your production system to shift? And so, yeah, I agree with you. You need a little more clarity, but I think that's where technical service is really important. And back to what was said by a few people, we don't always know what the practices are in every region and production system. And so we need both increased research on that, and we need technical service providers being better funded to go out and work with growers, to work with early adopter growers and say, what's been working for you? And then disseminating that knowledge. We need demonstration networks across the state and the country where growers can go see it actually happening. So RegenScore can't solve for this alone. I totally agree with you. It's a multidimensional problem, and it requires a lot of institutional engagement.
Ivo, I'm just curious. I was really struck by the way that you talk about transitional, and then something was in the middle, and then it was regenerative. So those are the early adopters and transitional. Did you have a period of time when you first shifted to this where your costs were higher and then they came down? Because I think what we've been seeing is a lot of the impact capital, social impact capital that is in this space is trying to, provide that period of time of experimentation where it's de-risking it to some degree for farmers. But I'm curious about whether you saw it immediately the first time you shifted over, or if you had a cost curve that came down.
Growing Cabernet Napa Valley is as far outlier to agriculture as you can imagine. So if you grow good Cabernet, you get $3,000 per ton.
That's true.
How can we compare that with growing soy and corn? So this is totally different.
That's true.
But to help you, just imagine how much money you spend on chemicals, Roundups, or pesticide, everything else. So just imagine if you can grow with your crop with spending $0 inputs. Also, this agriculture cannot work. The regenerative agriculture, you have to sell directly. If you're gonna grow corn and it's somebody determines it's $3 per bushel, there's no hope. You cannot be profitable. So there should be multiple crops. And I'm not expert in growing anything but grapes, but just using common sense. You have to diversify, you have to grow multiple crops, and you have to try to sell as much directly as possible. Cut that middleman. Middleman makes all money, not you.
I'm just going to the first person.
Yeah, I'm curious if you all can speak to how you envision regenerative agriculture at the intersection of California's really significant water scarcity challenges, particularly with regulations like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which are pretty rapidly increasing regulations and fees associated with oftentimes practices like cover cropping in the San Joaquin Valley, and kind of how you see regenerative agriculture working to address some of those challenges while also meeting producer needs with our increasing climate.
I can quickly answer. I already in my presentation showed that with improving soil structure and soil organic matter, you are holding far more, your soil is holding far more water. So we can, any year it can be dry farm. And you're absolutely right, pretty soon nobody's putting meters on our ground wells, but that's coming because we are pumping like crazy everywhere. So contrary to popular belief that when you cultivate soil, you preserve moisture, it's wrong. It's opposite. Actually, you're losing moisture. You're exposing your the cultivated soil to 150 degrees. That's how much soil heats up. You lose water. So by covering soil at all time, you are with cover crops, first green and then dry now, you are saving water. So this farming guarantee saves water.
I can speak a little bit to that too. Like basically what we're doing now with soils is all very short-term based. Like, we need, there's a rainstorm coming, let's till the soil. That is destroying structure. What Ivo said is totally true. Supporting soil health is going to, over time, help with water retention and infiltration, but it takes a long time. And that doesn't fit with the approach of conventional farming, of investing in natural resources, right? So now what we're trying to do is something different, and there's a risk involved, right? And that's what is kind of hard to assimilate, that there's gonna be a transition period, right? And there are no right answers. There's no recipe. It's also a very big change from conventional farming, where we use the same seed, the same fumigant, the same fertilizer everywhere. What works in California is not what works in the Midwest. And we need to know that. We don't have enough water. Maybe we can't grow a certain type of cover crop. And so that is where farmer knowledge, local-based knowledge is extremely important. And so we can't come with a definition of regenerative farming that we're going to bring to the farmers. We can't do things like that because that didn't work. We have to work with farmers and co-create that future, right? So
that's great. Yeah. I think we'll wrap up with that. We're at time, but
okay.
I want to thank the panelists, Cristina, Jess, Ivo, and Linda. Thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground on this topic. It clearly is very complex. Thank you to the audience for excellent questions. I'm sure we could go for hours and hours actually on this discussion, but unfortunately we have to get back to dinner and families and that kind of thing once in a while. So thank you guys for coming. I want to thank all our supporters, many of whom are here tonight, and also the UC Davis Library for this wonderful partnership. Of course, my team at the Robert Mondavi Institute for all the work you do behind the scenes to put on these events. Next week, a recording of this discussion will be available if any of you want to return back and review some of this material or share it with your friends who could not attend. I just want to thank you guys all again for joining us tonight, and let's have another round of applause for our panelists here.